It was a crisp Tuesday morning in the small, bustling town of Willow Springs. The courthouse, an imposing structure with towering white columns, stood like a silent sentinel in the heart of the city. The air was charged with a mix of anticipation and tension as people went about their routines, unaware that this day would unfold into something they would talk about for years to come. At the center of it all was Marcus Hill, a tall, poised black man in his early 40s. Marcus had a quiet confidence about him, sharp suit, polished shoes, and a determined stride that spoke of a man who had seen his share of struggles but refused to let them define him. He was headed to the courthouse for reasons he kept under wraps, a purpose that would soon shock everyone involved. Just a few blocks away, two police officers, Michael Sanderson and Todd Blake, were wrapping up their morning coffee run. They were seasoned officers, known around town for their brusque manner and a tendency to act on instinct rather than evidence. Their dynamic had earned them a reputation, feared by some, respected by others. That morning, as they cruised the streets in their patrol car, a call came through the radio about a theft at a high-end jewelry store downtown. The description of the suspect was vague. A black male, tall, dressed in a dark suit. Michael glanced out of the window and spotted Marcus walking along the sidewalk near the store in question. "That's him," he muttered to Todd, his voice filled with certainty that came more from bias than fact. Without hesitation, they flipped on their sirens and pulled over in front of Marcus. "Sir, stop right there," Michael commanded as he stepped out of the car, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Marcus paused, turning slowly to face them. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate the officers. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with cautious curiosity. "We got a report of a theft nearby," Todd said, stepping closer. "And you match the description." Marcus's brows furrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. "A theft," he repeated. "I think you have the wrong person." Michael wasn't convinced. "You mind explaining why you're dressed like you're hiding something?" he asked, his tone sharp, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. Marcus looked down at his suit and back at the officers. "I'm on my way to the courthouse. Not sure how that's suspicious." Todd scoffed. "Courthouse, huh? For what?" Marcus hesitated for a split second, debating whether to reveal the truth now or later. "I have an important appointment," he replied vaguely, his calm exterior never wavering. The officers exchanged a glance. To them, Marcus' reluctance to elaborate was as good as an admission of guilt. "Turn around," Michael said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "We're taking you in for questioning." Marcus sighed deeply, his frustration evident now, but he complied without resistance. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly as the cuffs clicked into place. The scene caused a small crowd to gather, their murmurs filling the air. Some watched with indifference, while others shook their heads in disapproval, recognizing the all-too-familiar pattern of racial profiling. Marcus was placed in the back of the squad car, his face unreadable but his mind racing. He knew this encounter wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. The drive to the station was tense. The officers, emboldened by their supposed catch, discussed the case as if it were already closed. Marcus, however, remained silent, his calm demeanor beginning to unnerve them. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was processed like any other suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his personal belongings confiscated, and he was placed in an interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, adding to the sterile, oppressive atmosphere. Michael and Todd entered the room, their confidence palpable. "So," Michael began, leaning against the table, "why don't you tell us what you were really doing near that store?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I told you. I was on my way to the courthouse." Todd crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. "You expect us to believe that?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Believe what you want. The truth will come out soon enough." The officers laughed, dismissing his words as bravado. They were so wrapped up in their assumptions that they failed to notice the subtle shift in Marcus' tone. A quiet warning they would soon regret ignoring. As the hours passed, word of Marcus' arrest began to spread. It wasn't long before a lawyer arrived at the station, a man who seemed to know exactly who Marcus was. The lawyer's presence sent a ripple of unease through the precinct. He handed over a file to the desk sergeant and demanded Marcus's immediate release. "What's this about?" Michael asked, his confidence faltering for the first time. The lawyer smirked. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, glancing at Marcus through the glass partition. "I'd get into court if I were you." The clock's ticking. Confusion turned to panic as the officers realized they might have made a grave mistake. They escorted Marcus, still in cuffs, to the courthouse, their previous provider replaced by a tense silence. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, watched as Marcus was brought in. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Marcus stepped forward, his cuffs removed, and he took his place, not in the defendant's seat, but behind the prosecution's desk. The room fell into stunned silence as Marcus adjusted his tie, picked up a stack of files, and addressed the court. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Marcus Hill, State's Attorney, representing the people of Willow Springs." The officers stood frozen at the back of the room, their faces pale as the realization hit them like a freight train. They hadn't just arrested an innocent man. They had arrested the very person who now held their careers in his hands. The judge glanced at the officers and raised an eyebrow. "I trust there's an explanation for this misunderstanding," she asked, her tone sharp. Marcus turned to face the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the officers and the crowd. "Oh, there's an explanation," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And I intend to get to the bottom of it." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence shattered. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget, one that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the weight of the situation settled over everyone present. Marcus Hill, the man they had seen in handcuffs mere moments ago, was now standing tall and commanding attention as the state's attorney. The officers, Michael and Todd, stood awkwardly in the back, avoiding eye contact with Marcus, the judge, or anyone else. Their confident veneer had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. Judge Carter cleared her throat, bringing the room to order. Her sharp gaze settled on Marcus, then flipped to the officers. "Mr. Hill, you have the floor. Let's hear it." Marcus adjusted his tie and stepped forward, his every move deliberate, as if he had choreographed this moment in his mind long before it happened. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm, "before we proceed with today's cases, I feel compelled to address a personal matter, one that highlights a serious issue within our community." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but a sharp rap of the judge's gavel silenced them. "Go on," Judge Carter said, her tone measured. Marcus turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. He could see confusion, curiosity, and a hint of shame in some. He let the silence linger for a moment, making sure he had everyone's attention. "This morning," he said, "on my way to this courthouse, I was stopped, questioned, and arrested by officers Sanderson and Blake. Their reason? I supposedly fit the description of a theft suspect." A collective gasp rippled through the room. People turned to look at Michael and Todd, whose faces flushed with embarrassment. Marcus continued, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "Now, I spent my career fighting for justice, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race or background, is treated fairly under the law. But today, I was reminded that the system I worked so hard to uphold still has cracks. Cracks that people like me fall through far too often." Judge Carter leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hill, are you suggesting this was an incident of profiling?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor. I'm stating it as a fact." The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Even those who didn't know Marcus personally could feel the gravity of what he was saying. This wasn't just about one man's experience. It was about a pattern that had plagued their community for generations. Marcus turned back to the officers, finally addressing them directly. "Officers Sanderson and Blake," he said, his tone unwavering, "did you even ask for my identification before deciding I was guilty of theft?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. We acted on the description we were given," he mumbled, avoiding Marcus' piercing gaze. "A vague description," Marcus countered, his voice rising slightly. "A tall black man in a suit. That could describe dozens of people in this city. But you didn't stop dozens of people, did you? You stopped me." Todd opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Marcus continued, now addressing the entire room. "And it won't be the last unless we confront it head-on." Judge Carter raised her gavel again, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Hill, while your points are valid, this is not the forum for a personal grievance. We have a docket to get through." Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand, Your Honor. But this isn't just personal. This is about justice. And if we can't address these issues here, in the very place designed to uphold the law, then where can we?" The judge regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "You've made your point, Mr. Hill. Let's proceed with today's cases. But I'll expect a formal complaint filed with the department if you intend to pursue this further." Marcus inclined his head in agreement and returned to his seat, his presence a stark contrast to the officers, who now looked smaller than they had where they walked into the courtroom. The rest of the proceedings carried on, but the tension lingered like an unspoken truth everyone was too afraid to confront directly. By the end of the day, the courtroom had emptied, leaving only Marcus and his legal team packing up their files. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows on the polished floors, giving the room an almost surreal quality. Marcus was deep in thought, replaying the events of the day in his mind, when a voice interrupted his reverie. "Marcus," a woman's voice called softly. He turned to see Angela Morrison, a local journalist known for her fearless reporting. She had a pen tucked behind her ear and a notepad in her hand, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus offered a small smile. "For you, Angela. Always. What can I do for you?" Angela hesitated for a moment, as if debating how to phrase her question. "Today was intense," she said finally. "What happened this morning? It's a story that needs to be told. But more than that, people need to understand the man behind the title. Why you do what you do." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed. "You want to know why I do this?" he asked, gesturing to the courtroom around them. "Because I've been on the other side. I've felt the sting of injustice, the weight of assumptions, the suffocating fear of not being seen for who you are, but for what people decide you must be." Angela nodded, scribbling notes furiously. "And this morning, did it bring back memories?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "It never left. Every time I walk into this courthouse, I'm reminded that the fight isn't over. But this morning, it was a reminder of how far we still have to go." Angela lowered her notepad, her expression softening. "You know, Marcus, not everyone would have handled today the way you did. Most people would have lost their cool, make things worse. But you turned it into something bigger." Marcus shrugged. "It's not about me, Angela. It's about everyone who's ever been in my shoes. If I can use my platform to make even a small change, then it's worth it." Angela smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Well, you've definitely got my attention. I'm pretty sure you've got the town's attention too." Marcus's phone buzzed, pulling him out of the moment. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Sorry, Angela. I've got to take this." As he walked away, Angela watched him go, her mind already racing with how to frame the story. This wasn't just another case of profiling. This was about a man who had turned his pain into power, his setbacks into strength. And she was determined to make sure the world knew it. Meanwhile, Marcus stepped into a quiet hallway to answer the call. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but something told him it was important. "This is Marcus Hill," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping in. There was a pause on the other end before a deep voice replied. Mr. Hill, this is Chief Reynolds. We need to talk about what happened this morning. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm glad you called, Chief, because we definitely need to talk. Marcus's grip tightened around his phone as he leaned against the wall. The echo of distant footsteps in the courthouse hallway was the only sound, aside from the faint crackle of the line. Chief Reynolds, the head of the Willow Springs Police Department, wasn't a man who called lightly. Marcus knew this conversation would be significant. Chief, Marcus said evenly, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. What can I do for you? There was a brief pause, followed by a measured sigh. It's not about what you can do for me, Mr. Hill, Reynolds replied, his tone cautious. It's about what I can do to make this right. I heard about what happened with my officers this morning. I need to understand the full story. Marcus's lips twitched into a humorless smile. The full story? Well, Chief, it's pretty straightforward. 2 of your officers profiled and detained me without cause, and now the entire town knows about it. Reynolds exhaled audibly. I'm not here to justify their actions. I want to know what steps we can take to move forward, without turning this into a spectacle. Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd heard this line before. Moving forward without a spectacle usually meant brushing the issue under the rug. With all due respect, Chief, this isn't about avoiding a spectacle. It's about accountability. Your officers acted on bias, and that bias nearly derailed my morning and my credibility. Reynolds' voice lowered. Marcus, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I also know you want solutions, not just headlines. How about we meet? Tomorrow. My office. Marcus considered the offer. Fine, he said after a moment. But I'm not interested in empty apologies, Chief. I want action. We'll talk tomorrow. He ended the call before Reynolds could reply, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The meeting could lead to meaningful change, or it could be another exercise in damage control. Either way, Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. As he returned to the courtroom to finish his day's work, a different storm was brewing across town. Michael and Todd sat in the dimly lit break room at the station, their voices low but heated. This whole thing's blown out of proportion, Michael muttered, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. We were doing our jobs, that's all. Todd leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Were we? Look, I'm not saying you meant anything by it. But maybe we jumped the gun. A guy like Marcus Hill doesn't exactly scream jewel thief. Michael shot him a glare. You're buying into the narrative already. This isn't about race or profiling. We had description, and we acted on it. End of story. Todd shifted uncomfortably. You saw the way people looked at us in court, Mike. This isn't going away. Maybe we need to own up to it before it gets worse. Michael slammed his coffee mug down, the sound reverberating through the room. Don't start with that. If we admit fault, it's open season on us. You know how these things go. Their conversation was cut short when the precinct sergeant, a gruff man named Harris, poked his head into the room. Chief wants to see you too. Now. They exchanged a glance before standing and heading to Reynolds' office. The atmosphere in the station was tense, the usual chatter replaced by hushed murmurs. As they entered, they'd found Chief Reynolds seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Sit, Reynolds ordered, gesturing to the chairs in front of him. He leaned back, his fingers steepled. I just got off the phone with Marcus Hill. He's coming in tomorrow. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Reynolds raised a hand to silence him. Let me make one thing clear. This situation is serious. Marcus Hill isn't just another citizen. He's the state's attorney. And the way this has played out has put a spotlight on this department that we don't need. Todd shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chief, we didn't mean. I don't care what you meant, Reynolds snapped. What matters is perception. Right now, this department looks like it's operating on outdated biases, and that's a problem. A big one. Michael clenched his fists. So what are we supposed to do? apologize and hope it all goes away. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice cold. What you're supposed to do is think carefully about how your actions reflect on this department. We'll discuss this further tomorrow. For now, keep your heads down and your mouths shut. The meeting ended with a heavy silence, and Michael and Todd left the office feeling the weight of impending consequences. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his home office, a cup of tea cooling on his desk as he reviewed case files. His mind kept drifting back to the morning's events. The anger he'd felt in the moment had dulled, replaced by a deep sense of purpose. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about changing a system that had failed so many others. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him from his thoughts. It was Angela. "Marcus," she said when he answered, her tone urgent. "I've been digging into those 2 officers. You're going to want to hear this." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his interest piqued. "I'm listening." Angela hesitated for a moment. This isn't the first time they've been accused of profiling. There are complaints, several, in fact, but most of them were quietly dismissed. No disciplinary action. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're sure?" "Positive," Angela replied. "I've got the records to back it up." "Marcus, this could be bigger than just your case." Marcus's mind raced. If Angela's information was accurate, it wasn't just about 2 officers making a mistake. It was about a culture within the department that allowed these behaviors to go unchecked. "Send me what you have," he said finally. "I'll take it from here." As the call ended, Marcus felt the weight of what lay ahead. The meeting with Chief Reynolds, the potential fallout for the department, and the broader implications for the community, all of it rested on his shoulders. But he wasn't backing down. This was his chance to push for real change, and he wasn't going to waste it. Across town, Angela sat at her desk, reviewing the documents she'd uncovered. Her instincts told her this story was bigger than she'd initially thought. It wasn't just about Marcus Hill or the officers involved. It was about systemic issues that had festered for years. And as much as she respected Marcus's fight, she knew her role was just as crucial. She had to bring the truth to light, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. As the night wore on, the city of Willow Springs seemed to hold its breath, events of the day leaving a ripple effect that touched everyone in some way. Marcus, the officers, the chief, and even Angela, all of them were caught in a web of choices and consequences that would shape not just their lives, but the future of their community. And with so many unanswered questions, one thing was certain: the story was far from over. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the Willow Springs Police Department just as the sun broke over the city. The air was crisp, and the streets were unusually quiet, as if the entire town was bracing itself for what was to come. Dressed sharply in a navy suit, Marcus carried himself with an unshakable confidence that only heightened the tension in the building. Officers glanced his way as he walked through the lobby, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Chief Reynolds was waiting for him in his office, the blinds drawn and the room dimly lit. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Marcus stepped inside, nodding politely. Reynolds motioned toward a chair, but Marcus remained standing, his posture rigid. "Mr. Hill," Reynolds began, his tone controlled. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "I'm here because I believe this conversation is necessary," Marcus replied. "But let's not waste time. I want to hear what you have to say." Reynolds leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I reviewed the incident reports from yesterday. I've spoken with Officers Sanderson and Blake. Their actions left a lot to be desired." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "A lot to be desired? Is that how you're framing it?" Reynolds's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to find solutions. If my department has failed in any way, I want to fix it. But I also need to know what you're expecting from this." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I want accountability. Not just for what happened to me, but for every person in this community who's been treated unfairly. I want training programs to address bias, transparency in handling complaints, and a clear message from you that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Reynolds nodded slowly. Those are reasonable requests. But you need to understand change takes time. It's not something I can implement overnight. Time is a luxury some people don't have, Marcus countered. Every day this goes unaddressed is another day someone else could be subjected to the same treatment. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Let me be clear, Mr. Hill. I'm willing to work with you on this, but the officers involved are already on edge. If we push too hard, too fast, it could backfire. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Backfire. You're worried about their comfort when they put mine on the line without a second thought. Chief, this isn't about what's easy. It's about what's right. Before Reynolds could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Angela stepped in, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She looked from Marcus to Reynolds, her expression unreadable. Am I interrupting? She asked, though she didn't wait for an answer. Marcus gestured for her to enter. Angela, this is Chief Reynolds. I assume you have something to share. Angela nodded and set a folder on the desk. I've done some digging. These officers, Sanderson and Blake, have a history. Multiple complaints filed against them for profiling and excessive force. Most of them were dismissed, but few cases were quietly settled out of court. Reynolds' face darkened as he flipped through the folder, his jaw tightening with every page. Where did you get this? He asked, his tone sharp. Angela shrugged. It's all public record, if you know where to look. I thought you'd want to see it. Marcus crossed his arms. This isn't just about one incident, Chief. It's about a pattern, a culture. And if you want to fix it, you need to start by acknowledging the depth of the problem. Reynolds sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. This is going to cause a stir. Good, Marcus said firmly. It's about time. Outside the office, the department was buzzing with activity. News of Marcus' meeting had spread, and officers whispered among themselves, speculating about what might come next. Michael and Todd sat at their desks, their faces pale. They could feel the walls closing in, though neither wanted to admit it. We're in trouble, aren't we? Todd said finally, breaking the tense silence. Michael didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low and strained. Only if we let this spiral. We need to get ahead of it. How? Todd asked. By admitting we were wrong. By apologizing. You know that's not how this works. Michael slammed his fist on the desk, drawing startled looks from nearby officers. Then we make it work. Because if we don't, we're finished. Meanwhile, Angela left the chief's office, her mind racing with how to present the story. She knew she had to tread carefully. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about holding people accountable in a way that led to real change. As Marcus exited the office shortly after, Angela caught up to him in the hallway. How do you think that went? She asked. Marcus' expression was unreadable. We'll see. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The tension in the city continued to build throughout the day. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire, with residents divided on where they stood. Some praised Marcus for standing up to the police, while others accused him of trying to create division. The story dominated local news, and by nightfall, it seemed like everyone in Willow Springs had an opinion. As Marcus sat in his living room that evening, watching the coverage on TV, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Angela. Asterisk, you were right. This is bigger than we thought. Be careful, asterisk. Marcus stared at the screen, her words echoing in his mind. He had always known the fight for justice wasn't easy, but now he could feel just how precarious the balance was. Every move mattered, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Across town, Michael and Todd sat in a bar, their drinks untouched as they watched the same news coverage. The weight of their decisions loomed large, and for the first time, they began to question not just their actions, but the system they had sworn to uphold. The city of Willow Springs felt like a ticking time bomb, every player in this unfolding drama teetering on the edge of their own choices. And as the tension reached its peak, everyone braced for the moment when everything would come crashing down. As Marcus stared at Angela's message, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. The number was blocked. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his instincts telling him this wouldn't be a casual conversation. "Hello," Marcus said, his voice firm but wary. A distorted voice crackled on the other end. "You're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any Mr. Hill. Some things are better left alone." Marcus's heart raced, but he kept his tone calm. "Who's this?" The caller ignored his question. "You're making enemies, and not just with the officers. Think carefully about your next steps. People are watching." Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, the threat echoing in his mind. It wasn't the first time he faced intimidation, but this felt different. It was calculated, deliberate, a warning from someone who wanted him to back off. Angela's message suddenly carried more weight. He picked up his phone and called her. She answered after the first ring, her voice slightly breathless. "Marcus, I was just about to call you. I found something else." "Hold that thought," Marcus said, pacing the room. "I just got a call. Someone's trying to scare me off." Angela fell silent for a moment. "Are you okay? What did they say?" "Enough to know I've struck a nerve," Marcus replied. "But I'm not backing down." "Now, what did you find?" Angela hesitated, and Marcus could sense her unease. "It's about the department," she said finally. "There's a whistleblower. Someone on the inside who wants to come forward about a cover-up." Marcus stopped pacing. "A cover-up?" "Yeah," Angela continued. "It's tied to your case. Remember the complaints I mentioned? Turns out, some of those settlements were pushed through by higher-ups to avoid public scrutiny. The whistleblower says there's evidence, documents, emails. But they're scared to release it without protection." Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just about two rogue officers anymore. It was systemic. The implications were staggering. "Can you arrange a meeting with this person?" "I can try," Angela said. "But they're paranoid. They don't trust anyone." "Tell them they can trust me," Marcus said firmly. "And make it clear. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to expose the truth." As Angela worked to connect with the whistleblower, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. Chief Reynolds found himself fielding calls from city officials, community leaders, and even the media. Everyone wanted answers, and the chief knew he was running out of time. In the middle of the chaos, Reynolds received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm but menacing. "You've got a problem, Chief, and if you're not careful, it'll become everyone's problem." Reynolds frowned. "Who is this?" "Think of me as a concerned party," the voice replied. "You need to make this go away. Hill doesn't know when to stop, and if he keeps digging, it's going to hurt a lot of people, including you." Reynolds' grip on the phone tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," the voice said smoothly. "I'm offering you a way out. Handle this quietly, or someone else will." The line went dead, leaving Reynolds with a sinking feeling. He'd always known his position came with challenges, but now it felt like he was standing in quicksand, every move pulling him deeper into danger. Meanwhile, Marcus received a text from Angela. Asterisk, the whistleblower agreed to meet. "Tonight. I'll pick you up, asterisk." That evening, as Marcus climbed into Angela's car, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The city felt different, darker, heavier. Angela drove in silence, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The meeting spot was an old diner on the edge of town. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the flickering neon sign cast eerie shadows. Inside, a lone figure sat in a corner booth, their face obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses. Angela and Marcus approached cautiously. The figure looked up, their voice barely above a whisper. "You're Marcus Hill." "That's right," Marcus said, sliding into the booth across from them. "And you are?" "Call me Sam," the whistleblower said. "I work in records at the department. Or at least I did, until I started asking too many questions." Marcus nodded. "What do you have for us, Sam?" Sam glanced around nervously before pulling a flash drive from their pocket. "Everything you need. Emails, internal memos, complaint files. It's all there. But you have to promise to protect me. If they find out I gave this to you, we'll protect you, Marcus assured them. This is bigger than any of us. The truth has to come out. Sam slid the drive across the table. Be careful, Mr. Hill. They won't go down without a fight. As Marcus and Angela left the diner, the tension between them was palpable. Angela clutched the flash drive like it was a lifeline, while Marcus scanned the parking lot, his instincts on high alert. Just as they reached the car, a dark SUV pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle idled for a moment before slowly circling around them. Marcus stepped in front of Angela protectively, his heart pounding. The SUV stopped briefly, its windows too tinted to see inside, before peeling out of the lot and disappearing into the night. Angela exhaled shakily. They're watching us. Marcus nodded, his jaw set. Let them watch. We're not stopping. With the flash drive in their possession, the stakes had never been higher. They'd had the evidence to blow the case wide open, but the forces working against them were closing in. As they drove back into the city, neither of them could shake the feeling that the battle was only just beginning. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, the flash drive plugged into his laptop. The files Sam provided were a treasure trove of damning evidence. There were emails from senior officers discussing how to contain complaints against Sanderson and Blake, records of settlements designed to silence victims, and directives from higher-ups urging officers to target specific neighborhoods for enhanced surveillance. It wasn't just corruption, it was systemic injustice, carefully orchestrated and ruthlessly maintained. Angela was beside him, meticulously cataloging the data. This is enough to blow the department wide open, she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and determination. There's no way they can deny this. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. We're going public. Today. They decided to hold a press conference on the courthouse steps. The media had been circling the story for days, and Marcus knew the time had come to take control of the narrative. By noon, reporters, activists, and curious citizens had gathered in a restless crowd, their cameras trained on the podium. As Marcus stepped up to the microphone, the air crackled with anticipation. He began by recounting his own experience, his voice steady but charged with emotion. Then he turned to the evidence. What I'm about to share is not just about me, he said, holding up a folder filled with printouts from the flash drive. It's about a system that has failed this community. A system that values silence over accountability. And today, we're breaking that silence. The crowd murmured as Marcus outlined the findings, every email, every memo, every detail that exposed the web of corruption within the department. Angela stood nearby, holding up copies of the documents for the cameras. As Marcus spoke, the tension in the crowd grew. Some people nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination, while others looked visibly shaken. Among them were a few uniformed officers, their expressions unreadable. Just as Marcus reached the conclusion of his statement, a commotion erupted at the back of the crowd. People turned to see Chief Reynolds pushing his way forward, his face pale but resolute. He climbed the steps and stood beside Marcus, drawing gasps from the audience. I have something to say, Reynolds announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Marcus stepped aside, watching cautiously as the chief took the microphone. For years, I've turned a blind eye to problems within this department, Reynolds admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I justified it by telling myself it was for the greater good, that I was protecting the force. But I see now that I was wrong. Mr. Hill is right. This system needs to change, and it starts with me. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Marcus watched Reynolds closely, unsure of what to make of the sudden confession. Before Reynolds could continue, a loud bang echoed through the square. The crowd screamed and scattered as a black SUV barreled through the barricades, skidding to a stop at the base of the steps. Marcus grabbed Angela and pulled her back, shielding her as two masked figures jumped out of the vehicle, wielding weapons. This ends now. One of them shouted, their voice distorted by a mask. Chaos erupted as the figures advanced, their intentions unclear. Marcus stood his ground, his heart racing as he locked eyes with one of them. He noticed a familiar gait, a way of moving that set off alarm bells. "It's them," Marcus said under his breath, his realization freezing him in place. Angela clutched his arm. "Who?" "Sanderson and Blake," Marcus whispered. "They're trying to shut this down." Before anyone could react, the two men lunged toward Marcus. But just as they reached the steps, several officers, those who had been silently watching from the crowd, stepped forward, drawing their weapons. "Drop it," one officer commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Sanderson and Blake froze, their plan unraveling as they realized they were outnumbered. Slowly, they dropped their weapons, their masks slipping to reveal their identities. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps as the officers moved in to handcuff the two men. Angela clung to Marcus, her breath coming in short gasps. "That was too close," she said. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "But it's over now." As Sanderson and Blake were led away, their faces twisted with anger, Chief Reynolds turned back to the microphone. His voice was steady now, resolute. "This department will be held accountable," Reynolds declared. "And I will personally ensure that those who betray the trust of this community are brought to justice." Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Willow Springs. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the square. Marcus watched, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. But just as he thought the ordeal was over, Angela tapped his arm and pointed toward the SUV. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "Look." Inside the vehicle, barely visible through the tinted windows, was a stack of documents and files. Marcus's heart sank as he realized the implications. "They weren't just here to stop us," he said. "They were here to destroy evidence." The officers quickly moved to secure the SUV, but the twist left Marcus uneasy. It was clear the battle for justice wasn't over yet. The system had deeper secrets, and Marcus knew he'd have to stay vigilant to uncover them all.